It was October 28th, 2019, in a stretch of road outside Pine Hollow, and the air had that wet, earthy smell that rolls in with harvest nights, sharp and cold enough to make your teeth chatter. I was 23, tired from a shift at the diner and short on patience, and I was driving two friends home when something impossible happened in the back seat. The passenger light was on, the dashboard hummed, and for a moment I thought one of us was playing a joke until I turned and saw a shape that was not human sitting between Jenna and Mark, hunched and quiet, looking out the window as if it belonged there. The hair on my arms rose, and for a second I felt like the whole world had moved a degree out of place. Jenna squeezed my hand without looking at me. Mark swore quietly, and the radio went thin. A fog began to roll across the cornfields, swallowing the shoulder lamps, and the shape lifted its head toward us slowly. I remember thinking I could see bone through its skin. I remember thinking that if I kept driving, we would leave it behind and nothing would change. But the rearview mirror showed more of it than one person should ever see. My chest went cold, and I promised myself I would tell the whole thing, because calling someone at 3 in the morning felt like the only sane thing to do. That is when I heard the scraping on the roof and the sound that would live in my head for months, like fingernails pulled across dry wood. I tell you the date because people always ask, and because it matters to the authorities who later took statements. With me were Jenna, Mark, and Luis. Let me start at the beginning, because none of this read like a single night at first, and because the nights I drove home different friends in different years are the only nights I still replay. I grew up in small towns where everyone knew everyone else and secrets were rare because the roads were short and the diners loud. My name is Daniel. I worked nights as a line cook at Ruby Cafe so I could keep odd hours and pay rent on the old house I shared with Jenna for a while. Jenna was an art student who painted by moonlight and taught ceramics on weekends. Mark worked construction and swore like the town had nothing else to give him. Luis had moved back from the city 3 years earlier after his father died and kept to himself unless you asked about baseball. We all had small, reasonable explanations for why we drove late and why we took the long route home sometimes. There was comfort in routine. On that October night, Jenna had closed at a studio an hour before my shift ended and asked if I could drop her off near her place, which was on the opposite side of town by an old barn that never seemed to sleep. Mark had asked for a ride because his truck had a flat, and Luis was supposed to be just a passenger going to his sister's house. I told them it was fine. I also told myself it would be an ordinary drive, that the worst we would face was a pothole or a drunk driver. That was the backstory in brief, but the things people keep out of their explanations matter. I had driven that road 100 times, past the bonfire field and the rusted porch light that blinked intermittently at the old Tucker place. The Tucker barn had a sagging roof, and that summer it had been the scene of a party that ended with police lights and a local paper article. I mention that because small towns remember physical places, like cemeteries remember names. And the road we took that night had a memory that night that we were about to touch. The first incident that set everything in motion happened when we passed the abandoned feed store, a block of broken glass and sagging timbers that smelled like old hay and spilled oil. I saw a figure on the shoulder and slowed, because you slow where other people might be in trouble. We were not far from the highway turn where the streetlights give up and the corn takes over. Jenna swore softly and covered her face with her hands. Mark said it was probably someone hitchhiking. Luis frowned into his phone and said, "Check for service." I flicked on the interior light to get a better look, and that is when I noticed that the person was too thin, like a shadow wrapped around bone, sitting perfectly still beside the road. I slowed to a stop, and the engine ticked as it cooled. The figure did not move. There was a smell like pennies and damp paper coming from it that made me want to retch. I rolled down the window because my popcorn reflex was to try to understand things by getting closer, by touching them and seeing what happened. The figure parted its scrawny legs and lifted its head. It had no hair, and its mouth hung open too wide, not in a human expression. It blinked, and the whites of its eyes reflected the dashlights like glass. I remember our conversation like it was two voices on a bad line. Jenna whispered, "Are you going to help it?" Mark said we should call someone, and Luis said, "Do not get out of the car." I said I would get out, that I would at least tell whoever this was that we were calling an ambulance. I was still thinking in the small, calm way that people try to reason through emergencies. When I opened the door, the sound from outside was the corn rubbing against itself, and then a small, wet click, like a tongue pushing across a tooth. The thing in the field said my name. At first, none of us believed it, because the voice was thin and scratchy and not matched to any mouth we could see. It said, "Daniel," with the kind of intimacy that makes you think of an old neighbor calling across a fence. I stepped back, and the bottle of water I had in hand spilled with a small clink on the asphalt. Jenna started to cry. Mark cursed and reached for something under his seat. Louis stood there like a photograph until the person rose slowly and walked toward the car in a gait that was all wrong, joints popping in directions they should not. It set its hand on the hood, and the skin made a noise against metal like wet leather. I locked the doors. The passenger light clicked on by itself, and inside the car, everything felt magnified. The taillights of a passing truck smeared red across the field, and for a second I thought we were safe with nothing more than embarrassment. The thing knocked on the window with two long fingers. I will not describe everything the way a scientist catalogs specimens, because I was not a scientist. I was a scared kid with a car full of friends and a sense that something already broken was getting worse. The first scene ended when the thing reached into the car and touched Jenna, and her whole body thinned like wax under heat. Her breathing hitched, and she rolled her head and met my eyes like a child in need of help. Mark tried the passenger door, but it would not open. The locks were jammed. That precise click is a sound I still wake to sometimes. A small, limited sound that means everything you think is fixed is not. After that first night, the next hour was a jumble of actions that make up the middle portion of most stories and of police reports. We drove off when the thing let go. It did so without a sound and without looking back. We sped through fields, and the radio tried to fill the emptiness with music that made no sense to anybody. We pulled into Jenna's driveway, and she ran to the porch and banged on the door of her neighbor, Molly, who came out in a robe holding a flashlight and with a face like someone had asked her to sign for a curse. Molly called 911 and said, please come," and then we all started talking at once, trying to explain how the thing had said my name and touched Jenna, and how her hand felt cold after, and how the car locks had jammed. The dispatcher asked for names and addresses and repeated everything so slowly I could taste the syllables. When the patrol arrived, Officer Parker and Deputy Whitman came with flashlights and a measured, official calm that small towns have when they want to reassure people that only they are in charge of fear. They took statements. Someone from the county forensics team came later that night, and the word that settled in my chest was Parisha. They took fingerprints from the door handle and photographed the impression where the thing had pressed on the hood. I remember handing over my keys to a gloved tech and feeling my life shrink to a metal object and a piece of paper with a case number on it. That night, the police took all our statements, and I said words that would later be repeated in the report and in emails from the sheriff. The forensics tech bagged a small smear of something on the passenger window and labeled it Chain of Custody 1. Chain of custody means that every item of evidence is tracked from the place it was found to the locker where it is stored, so that it can be used later if needed. The idea of chain of custody is meant to protect evidence from contamination. In practical terms, it means someone puts a seal on a bag and writes their name and the date and time and signs it, so nothing can be altered without someone being able to say who touched it and when. That explanation is important because human beings tell stories with loose edges, and because later the chain would be questioned. We all thought that would be an end, a single night logged under a case number with a description of an unidentified person on the roadside. We did not yet know that this was the beginning of 3 nights that would end up recorded in separate reports and linked by a single feature which I will get to. The second night happened 9 months later on November 13, 2020. I had moved out of the house I shared with Jenna and taken a night shift at a warehouse in a different town. I was driving Caleb, who worked nights with me, when we saw a figure in the rearview mirror again. Caleb was 26, tall, and the kind of man who would laugh at small terrors and then lie awake for them later. He had been through a divorce and said things about the road that made me feel like a passenger on a boat he had sailed before. That night, the fog was worse. It lay along the road like a second skin, and the truck lights did nothing to slice through it. We were on Route 9 near the abandoned Miller estate. I had never felt comfortable near that house. The porch step was missing, and there were boards nailed over a window in a way that suggested someone wanted to keep something from leaving. We spotted a hunched figure under a traffic sign, and in the glow of our headlights, it moved toward the car with speed that did not match its shape. The sense of wrongness this time was compounded by sound, something that sounded like a hinge grinding under stress echoed across the empty road, followed by a thin, high laugh that matched no human timbre. I stopped. Caleb told me to keep driving. I told him I could not in good conscience leave. I got out without thinking. The figure sat on the guardrail and turned to face me. Its mouth opened and it began to sing in a voice that was a child's and an old man's at the same time. The song had words I could almost make out, like names and small phrases. It said Jenna. It said Luis. It said things only someone who had been near us would know. That was when I realized it was not random. It followed us. Small signals like footprints in damp soil or a fresh set of tire tracks tell you when something has been where it should not. On that second night, I found claw marks in the insulation under the Miller house porch and saw bits of fabric that matched the jacket Caleb wore the week before when he had left a party early. We took pictures with our phones and compared notes with Officer Whitman, who answered our call. Whitman stayed calm and referred us to records. He checked his notebook and said that similar reports had come in at 3 other points along Route 9 in the past year, but had been dismissed as prank calls or misidentified animals. He asked for the photos and asked for our statements. At that point, I was starting to see that the 3 incidents belonged to a pattern. What linked them, besides the physical descriptions, was an oddness in the way the creature or person or thing addressed us. Each time it spoke a name of someone close to us. Each time it seemed to know small secrets. Each time it left a mark that could be photographed and bagged, but that made no sense in biology. The text described a mark that they could not identify, something like a burn and a scrape combined. They took swabs that later came back negative for typical pathogens and inconclusive across a number of tests. The lab notes included words like atypical tissue and recommended further analysis. We were told to expect delays. There was a point about a third of the way through my memory where I needed to break and ask you a question. If this has made you uneasy, you are not alone. When I told friends about the incidents, they argued about whether it had been someone playing a cruel joke or whether sleep deprivation and too many late nights had assembled our fears into a shape. If you have ever sat in a car and suspected you were being watched, or if a voice called your name on a night with no one else around, please write in the comments and tell us what happened. Start with the 2 words, "This story made me keep." Those words are, I. Remember, and then add a single line about where you were standing or what you heard. Do you think these were human intruders or something else? Vote in the comments with human or other and tell us one sentence explaining why. People read comments, and sometimes other viewers reach out after seeing a similar pattern in their town. Sharing helps us to see whether small incidents are isolated or part of something larger. For me, the comments were how I kept from going mad at times, seeing others who also had a name shouted across a field and who also saw shapes in fog. Now, back to the nights. The third night was the one that burned the image into my memory the way a brand sears an animal. It was October 31, 2021, and I was driving Rachel and Sam home after a Halloween shift at the Lake Festival. The roads were full of last-minute revelers and exhausted volunteers. There was a bonfire still smoking at the park entrance, and the smell of charred wood and caramel apples was dense and sweet. I had driven home hundreds of people who smelled like that, but the sound that came after was new. We were on County Road 12 heading away from the festival when a small shape appeared suddenly to the left of the road, and then stepped into our lane. I swerved and almost hit a mailbox. Rachel screamed. Sam braced with his hands on the dash and said, "Slow down." I braked to a stop, breath shallow, and everything in the car pulled inward like fabric in a vacuum. The passenger side door opened and a figure clambered into the seat. This one wore something like a coat that had been lengthened at strange angles. Its fingers had small rings that scraped metal when it adjusted its knees. It smelled faintly of smoke and of something sweet rotting in the back of my mouth. The voice that told me Happy Halloween was not human. It sounded like a radio that had been left underwater. It said, "We have been looking for you." It said, "We know your routes." It said, "It had been patient." The thing was small enough to fit in the seat, and when it looked up, I saw a patch of skin at the temple that was pale and translucent, and across it a line like a healed cut or an unnatural seam. I thought I would pass out. I thought if I screamed, everyone around would hear and we would be safe. The people at the park did not hear because they were deep into their cups, and their laughter sounded ironic and too far. I kept my hands on the wheel. Sam told me to drive to the police station, and Rachel whispered for me not to make sudden moves. The thing in the passenger seat looked at us and smiled in a way that showed teeth too many and too sharp. What followed in the car over the next 30 minutes is a clash I will be forced to replay forever because it was full of dialogue, of bargaining, of small human things that are absurd when life is raw. The exchange between us had a rhythm like the staccato of a machine. I said, "Who are you?" It said, "The passenger you do not see." I said, "Get out." It said, "I do not leave." I said, "You are not welcome here." It said, "I belong in the warm places of your memory." Rachel said, "Please, please stop." The thing looked at Rachel and said, "You like to draw hands." Sam said, "That is not funny." It said, "The way you tie your shoes means you cut your thumb once when you were 7. I looked at Sam and he lowered his face. I said to the thing, "Do you hurt people?" It said, "Sometimes." I asked, "Why follow us?" It said, "To know." It said, "It collects the names of those who listen." Rachel sobbed quietly. Sam put his hand on her knee and said, "We need to get out." The thing leaned closer to the dash and laughed low and liquid. I turned the key in the ignition and nothing at first. The dashboard went dark and the red clock read 11:47. The car stuttered and then started. I asked it where it wanted to go, and it said, "Home is a moving thing." I told it to leave. It said, "Leave is a word like any other," and told me to remember the attic at my father's old place. I said, "Stop saying that." And it said, "Your father used to keep a box under the floorboards, and in that box was a small note with your name spelled wrong." Sam cried out and asked how it could possibly know that, and the thing replied with soft amusement that it knows what is hidden under porch steps and under loose floor treads in old houses. It said it has been where we have been and seen what we think we hid. The conversation was punctuated by Rachel begging and by my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles whitened. It wanted us to take it further down the road, which terrified me, and it wanted me to stop at a bridge that crossed the river where I used to fish with my brother. I did not know what would happen if I complied. I did not know whether following its request would make it leave or whether it would take something of us in exchange. The creature sounded patient and oddly maternal. It promised warmth and a truth if we would only stop and listen to it. Mark had once told me never to negotiate with the strange in the dark. I thought of that and of the months of reports where the thing had learned our names and our secrets. I made a choice. I drove to the nearest well-lit station at the crossroads that had bright sodium lamps and a camera that I hoped recorded license plates. I told the thing I would not be blackmailed into some performance. It said that was wise. It said that wise people are the best stories. The car idled and sweat ran down my back. The station parking lot lights hummed, and a man in a reflective vest stood by a pump and watched us like we might blow up. I parked, left the door locked, and stepped out holding my phone. The thing pounded a fist lightly on the glass, a polite tap like someone asking for attention. Rachel whispered that she could hear muttering and that it sounded like a crowd of people telling stories under their breath. Sam called 911 and said there was someone in the car with us who would not leave. The dispatch voice asked for details and for a location and for whether the person was armed. I said they were not armed in the common way. The man in the reflective vest, whose name later turned out to be Gerald and who became a witness, came over with his coffee and peered in the passenger window. He said that if anyone was in the car, they should leave, and if we felt threatened, he would call the police. The thing smiled at Gerald and said, "Your coffee tastes like regret." And Gerald stood still as if someone had told him a joke in a language he did not know. He stepped back and said he would go into the store. We were suddenly alone with the passenger again, and the lights of the convenience store washed the inside of the car flat and clinical. The thing touched the window with both hands, and then, without a sound, climbed out and walked toward the pumps, moving like someone who had practiced careful exits. It vanished between the cars like smoke and left no footprints. The aftermath is where documents and the official world take over, and where my memory meets the formality of names and numbers. The police took our statements at the station, and Officer Parker and Deputy Whitman compared notes with Gerald and the clerk inside, who had seen a pale figure pass between the pickup trucks. The report listed things in a way meant to look neutral. It recorded time, location, witness names, and a short description of the person. The forensics team collected swabs from the interior of our car and photographed the seat where the passenger had touched the upholstery. They bagged a small ring the size of a coin they found on the dash. The ring later tested with inconclusive metal content. The lab results were one of those things that read like a reprimand because they did not confirm what anyone had hoped. They found no known DNA and no recognized pathogens. They cataloged odd fragments of tissue that did not match. Human tissue, but did react to certain stains in a way that appeared like partial collagen structure, degraded beyond normal. The pathologist who reviewed the slides wrote that the sample was atypical and suggested further genetic sequencing. The chain of custody logs show who handled the items and when, and are dated and initialed in the files. Over the next week, Sheriff Whitman called to ask more questions and told us they were looking into similar calls across 3 counties. Officer Parker drove out to my apartment and asked me to point at places where I thought incidents had clustered. He listened and took notes and gave me a number to call if anything happened again. He warned me, in that soft voice of someone who does not want to alarm but knows the bell tolls, to take different routes and to travel with light. The investigation never produced a complete answer. There were leads that went nowhere and neighbors who came forward with odd sightings. A fisherman, an elderly woman named Agnes, reported a shape like a child standing under the bridge. A trucker named Walt reported a hitchhiker with no bag who had been seen at 3 exits along I-84. The sheriff convened a briefing, and someone from the county lab briefed us with a mix of professional calm and obvious puzzlement. The report used the word unclassified several times. There was also a small entry in the county newspaper where a beat reporter wrote of unusual late-night calls and of residents who blamed sleep deprivation and Halloween pranks. Some of those who had seen the figures told police they felt emotionally exposed after the events and that they were more anxious at night. A local pastor named Reverend Cole offered a prayer meeting to help people feel safe, and a few of us went because ritual of any kind is comforting after the world seems arbitrary. The town held an open meeting where Sheriff Whitman explained the official procedures and asked residents to report anything unusual and to secure their homes. He promised more patrols at night. None of these things fixed the intangible, and the lab results that might have been decisive stayed inconclusive and embargoed, in part because the tissue samples did not conform to known metrics. The public records related to the case remain flagged with an internal note suggesting follow-up if new evidence is submitted. 1 month later, I was still driving and still changing routes because habit can be a scar that does not fully fade. At 1 month, I had developed an anxiety about back seats. I installed a dash camera and set it to record both in front and in the cabin. I started to sleep with the living room light on, and I asked Jenna and Mark and Luis to come over more often, just so there were other bodies in the house. I avoided bridges at night. I stopped taking long walks alone. The most immediate concrete change was that I no longer parked with my passenger window down, even during summer. I also called a locksmith and had new locks put on my doors. I met with Officer Parker, who offered a recording of the 911 call we made on that third night, and he gave me a copy of the incident number. The presence of the camera brought a small comfort, even as it recorded nothing extraordinary. My relationships became tighter in a practical way because fear makes people call and check in, and that made me feel less alone. I heard from Rachel that she had nightmares for weeks, and from Sam, who said he could not sit in the front seat without looking over his shoulder. Molly texted that she had seen a pale figure standing by the Tucker barn at 2 a.m. and that she had called the sheriff. Gerald from the gas station came by to tell me he had found a small ring near a pump months later, and that he had kept it because he wanted to make sure it went into evidence. Calls from reporters started and then faded when the lab results were inconclusive. 3 months after the incidents, there was a small community meeting at the firehouse. Sheriff Whitman presented a slideshow of reports and asked people to be vigilant. He read anonymized excerpts from statements and spoke about possible causes, including misidentification of wildlife, hoaxes, and a cluster of sleep-related auditory hallucinations reported by people with similar work hours. Some town council members proposed extra lighting, and the mayor approved a night patrol for the most affected roads. A local journalist published an in-depth piece that included quotes from an anthropologist who suggested that stories like ours cluster around cultural memory and seasonal anxieties. That explanation sits beside our personal experiences and does not erase the physical evidence. A few new witnesses came forward. A woman named Ellen reported a figure at the edge of her yard, and a teenage boy named Tyler mentioned the same. We mapped out the sightings and found they clustered along old roads and near places that had been sites of loss, like the boat ramp and an old orphanage. People began to bolt their sheds and to install motion-activated lights. The feeling of community care was real and comforting, and yet inside my chest there remained a low hum of unease, a curiosity about what the thing was and what it wanted. I started keeping a notebook with times and short descriptions. I learned my reactions and my limits. 6 months after the final event, life had resumed a shape that allowed for normalcy, but not without small scars. I had changed jobs to one with daylight hours, so my nights were less empty. I still sometimes woke in the night and checked the rearview mirror for no reason. Jenna moved to a different state to continue art school, and we exchanged long letters. About how to frame memory in a painting. Mark got married and named the best man Louis, and I was invited but declined because the thought of traveling that road felt like reopening a wound. Sergeant Parker sent an update that a regional lab had received a request to sequence the tissue samples, but that the process was slow and that preliminary runs had not produced a match to known genomes in their database. The sheriff suggested that we might have encountered an unknown animal or a human with severe deformities, and that possibility lived in the world of plausible explanations like a shadow that keeps its edges. Some nights I dream of small hands tapping on glass and of a voice that knows too much. Other nights I find myself grateful for the camera footage showing nothing more than a lane of empty road and the grain of cheap asphalt. The ring Gerald found was catalogued as evidence and remains in the county evidence locker with a tag. The investigation remains open and the chain of custody forms are filed in duplicates. The physical world took care of what it could with procedures and reports, and the social world responded with lights and meetings and a new caution at the edges of late nights. I will not pretend to know what the 3 passengers were. I do not have a neat folder labeled answers. I have a set of experiences that are too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence and too inconsistent with known biology to provide comfortable explanations. What I do have are the ways my life shifted, the people who stood with me in literal light at a gas station, the forensics techs who wrapped evidence in glossy bags and wrote their names on the seals, the sheriff who promised more patrols, and the odd kindnesses of strangers who left a porch light on when they saw me walking. I have the presence of mind to tell you these nights were not games, and that after them I was quieter, more attentive to small knocks on doors. I also have the inability to stop repeating the same question in my head, which is why I come back to the road and sometimes take the long way home. If you found this story unsettling, please subscribe if you want more investigations and personal accounts. Subscribing helps me gather more reports and gives me a platform to share updates, documents, and sometimes raw recordings when they become public. If you have a similar story, start your comment with "I remember" and tell the time and place in a single line, because small facts help us map patterns. I read every comment and sometimes bring follow-up interviews into future episodes. In the end, I keep thinking of the passenger who was not human and of how memory keeps its own lights. I remember the way the fog swallowed the fields and how the creature touched the hood and said, "My name," as if it had always been waiting to test whether names are doors. I remember Jenna clinging to the door, and Molly on the porch with a flashlight, and Gerald with his coffee. And I remember the officer who shook his head when he could not explain a smear on the glass. I still drive with a camera and a friend beside me if I can help it. I still avoid bridges at night when possible. I still have the case numbers saved in a file on my computer, and sometimes I open them just to feel the shape of what happened, as if reading labels could make events obey. Some doors close with a click and never reopen. Other doors seem to wait for the right set of hands. I do not know whether that passenger will ever return. I do not know whether anyone else will feel a name whispered across a field or a tap on the window in a night that smells like charred apples. All I know is that these are true accounts as far as I lived them, and that the road keeps stories in its shoulder like secrets pressed into the dirt. If you want to hear more, subscribe and share your memory. If I learn anything new, I will come back and tell it as plainly as I can, because the only weapon I have against being haunted is telling the truth aloud.